I've unmuted you because it's almost time to start. It's 5:30 and good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight. This promises to be an informative conversation about the great penguin rescue in 2000 at the Treasure Oil spill in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm Russ Curtis. I've been with Bird Rescue for a number of years, and I'll be your moderator this evening. Executive Director JD Bergeron is in the wings, but he's sort of handing the reins to me because I was actually at the spill 20 years ago as a volunteer. And I spent a month helping feed and kind of tend to some penguin enclosures. And joining us tonight are two of Bird Rescue's leaders in the organization. And they've been involved in spill response for quite a long time. And I want you to please welcome Barbara Callahan and Mark Russell. Barbara is the Response Services Director at Bird Rescue and has been on the team since 1997. And she has a wide range of experience in wildlife response and has been instrumental in managing our Alaska Wildlife Response Center. That's in Anchorage. And in 2014, after our longtime director, Jay Holcomb, passed away, she took over as interim executive director. She has a degree in biological science from the University of Washington, and she resides in Washington State. Mark Russell is a long-term member of Bird Rescue's wildlife response team. He has held a number of, I'm going to switch back, hold on a second. He's held a number of positions at Bird Rescue, including manager of our Los Angeles Wildlife Center. He's also done a lot of training with us and has contributed scientific papers. His first effort working with Bird Rescue was in 1990 when he volunteered at the American Trader oil spill in Southern California. He's working on his master's degree at San Francisco State in avian parasitology, and he lives in San Francisco. I also should mention that Mark is my husband, and
that's how you managed to get to South Africa.
I will. I just was getting to that. He asked me to buy a ticket because they need some more volunteer help down there, and I did buy a ticket, and I'll say that I think we saved a little bit of money that year because we were spending so much money on international phone calls. This is back when calling South Africa was quite expensive. I think there was one month it was $600.
Well, let me say this: you were worth your weight when you got on the ground in Cape Town, and you more than made up for that.
Well, I couldn't go back to the hotel because you kind of kept me hostage at Salt River, if I remember right.
That's what we do.
Yep. And
you're here, you're working.
So one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is that we started this whole project this summer. This is like I said, the 20th anniversary. The spill was 3 months long. One of the things that we thought we'd try to invite people with is to get into the spill, and Diane Dinolipi is actually on the webinar tonight, and she wrote a great book that's a narrative of what happened at the spill, and it's got some great detail, and if you haven't got a chance to read it, I recommend it highly. So there's our panelists. And I thought maybe we'd start off and just give you guys a quick overview of the spill. A lot of you have read the book or read parts of it and probably learned a little bit about the spill. It was an incredible approach to rescuing 20,000 oiled penguins. And it all started June 23rd in 2000 when this ship that's about 900 feet long, carrying I think it was iron ore, and it was headed from China to Brazil. It started leaking bunker fuel, it sank, and it left a huge mess. And if you look at this map, you can see one thing. We're going to talk about Salt River in blue, but between Dawson and Robben Islands on this map is where the treasure sank, about 6 miles off the coast of Cape Town, which is in probably the southernmost tip of South Africa. the immediate response to all this oil in the water is penguins, which were foraging for fish, got extremely oiled by this very heavy bunker crude oil. And as you can see, it was everywhere, and there really was no way for these birds to escape this. And I thought this was interesting that 20% of the total population of African penguins is oiled at this spill.
And that picture was taken less than 24 hours after it spilled on Robben Island.
Right.
See, every bird in there is oiled.
So folks went to work to corral these guys and get them into care. Working with penguins is a tricky one. They've got flippers, they've got feet, and they bite and will scrape your skin really easily. So you can see people who are wearing gloves, and they're just trying to wrangle these penguins.
Or break a finger bone.
Yep, absolutely. And I just wanted to segue into kind of pull back a little bit, because we're right start in the middle of the spill, but I think the idea is to come back and talk about the partnerships that not only we connected on this spill, but we had been working with both these organizations, SANCOB for a lot longer, but IFAW was a really critical partner in this whole thing. And I think it would be important, Barbara, just to talk about the history of that from your perspective, especially
Sure.
IFAW.
Sure. Well, for those who don't know, SANCOB, and I know the letters don't quite match up to the Southern African Foundation for the Conservation of Coastal Birds. They call it SANCOB, the local wildlife rehabilitation group there, and they have been responding to catastrophic oil spills involving penguins and other birds, as well as animals that get oiled, penguins and other birds that get oiled from what we often call chronic oiling or bilge dumping, because it happened a lot down there. So at any time, they might have oil birds in care. And Mark can speak to kind of the early relationship, and I know you probably will, Mark, but early on, before the treasure spill, we had been involved with SANCOB, and the most notable, I know Mark had been there several times before treasure, but most notable was the Apollo C spill in '94. 10,000 African penguins were oiled, 5,000 died in transport. We're going to talk more about that because that was a real learning moment. But at that spill, we sent several of our staff there, and nobody at SANCOB knew who bird rescue was, and they didn't know who our staff was. It was quite an interesting time. But that's when our director then, Jay Holcomb, met Sarah Scarth from the International Fund for Animal Welfare. And she was the emergency relief director. Actually, I think she was still country office director, but then just at that time becoming the emergency relief director for IFAW and the oil wildlife division that they had. And we were their oil wildlife team. So I always say when I talk about treasure, the things that, among many others, including the expertise on the ground, one of the reasons it was so successful was because the director of SANCOB, Estelle van der Merwe, immediately picked up the phone that morning, Friday morning, the 23rd of June, 2000, and called Sarah and said, "You got to bring the team, bring everybody, like, don't hold back." Because sometimes when we're in this business, oh, let's just wait and see if we're going to get animals. Guess what? You're going to get animals. Call the team in. So they didn't hesitate. And our director, Jay, was on a plane that day. And I think, Mark, you were right behind. And it was IFAW who said, look, we're going to take care of the funding. And they put it out there. They were like, no matter what, we're here with you. And Mark, you can tell the fish story, and when we thought we weren't going to get any fish paid for, and that's how we got there with IFAW. And for many years, 12 years after that, we were basically seconded to IFAW as their oiled wildlife team, and they put us in places around the world that we probably never would have gotten to without that support. So yeah, good job, IFAW.
I think if I can add the reason why we maintained this partnership with SANCOB is because what we offered them was our management, our ability to manage an oil spill, from the search and rescue to stabilization to washing, which they had not washed birds prior to our working with them. Their protocol was to let the birds work the oil out of their feathers on their own, which takes up to a month. And of course, if you only have a small number of birds, that's manageable. But with more than 1,000 birds, that's really unmanageable to care for birds and let them just work it out on their own. So we introduced washing, and then we introduced some other areas of expertise, particularly volunteer management. We were really the ones that when Jay went over in '94, he was cleaning buckets in cages, but because they didn't know who he was, and they didn't realize what a piece of gold they had in their possession with Jay, and once we earned their trust and they gave us responsibility, we really showed them how we could keep things organized and streamline their process from intake to release. And that's why they really relied on us in these larger events, because they knew that any one of our team members could effectively assist in the management of the volunteers and the flow of the system. And that's really what we were there for, to manage.
Great, thank you, Mark. I'm gonna switch over to a message from Sarah Scarth. She's in South Africa in a different time zone, and it's winter down there, and it's about, 9 hours ahead. So she's sleeping, hopefully, but she's going to say hello.
Hi, my name is Sarah Scott, and really pleased to be with you to share my memories of the treasure oil spill. At the time, I was the Emergency Relief Director for IFAW, or the International Fund for Animal Welfare. And as part of that, was responsible for our oiled wildlife division. I had the good fortune of meeting Jay and Kurt and Mark back in '94 in Cape Town when the Apollo C oil spill took place. I was green to oiled wildlife response. I was never responded to anything like that before. I was just thrown into it, and what I witnessed was the most amazing, leadership and ability to be able to impart skills and knowledge in some of the most difficult circumstances. And so from that initial meeting and working together, washing buckets, and then managing to convince those in charge to listen and to learn. Over the years, we then worked together and built up this international oiled wildlife response team that was funded and supported by IFAW. And so really, whilst the treasure oil spill was just the most unbelievable disaster, 20,000 oil penguins seriously endangering the entire population, was just devastating. It was really fortuitous that this international oiled wildlife response team existed, because we were able to activate it really quickly. And just like any other oil spill that had happened before, the team mobilized immediately, and the bird rescue team were on the ground within a few days. And then over the next 2.5 to 3 months, it was just incredible what was carried out. And I still stand in awe of what was accomplished by so many people who just pulled together to achieve something of a miracle. And I feel a great sense of pride and real privilege to have been a part of it, to have been able to have worked so closely with the amazing bird rescue team, and especially with Jay, to be able to have played such a critical role in ensuring that that terrible oil spill did not result in the deaths of thousands and thousands of penguins. And so I just really give my deep and sincere thanks to Bird Rescue for the unbelievable commitment, to their leadership in championing and leading the improvement of old wildlife response, not just in the Bay Area, but globally. And it's because of that that disaster was not one that was a real disaster. And so I just give thanks for Bird Rescue, and I just honor every member of the team, and importantly every member of the Old Wildlife Response team and all the thousands of volunteers who came together to be part of that incredible effort. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. I think one of the things I wanted to talk about is, Mark, your first impressions of getting to the Salt River Penguin Crisis Center, and maybe talk a little bit about some of the logistics that, and some of the.
So when Jay went over there, I think he first went with Linda and himself and Linda Elliott, and he put me on call, but I was in school at the time trying to finish my degree. It took forever. And so he wanted to go check it out and see what was needed and see if it was really as bad. And when he got there, the first thing he did was call me and say, yes, this is not only as bad as reported, but it's much, much worse. And I wasn't prepared for what I came into, and I just wasn't. And they hadn't even found Salt River yet at that point, and all the birds hadn't been taken off the island. So by the time I got there, all the birds were off the island, and they were still being unloaded into Salt River off these massive trucks. So we drove up to Salt River with Mariette Hopley, and she was showing us around, and I walked in and it smelled like oil and penguin guano and fear, because these penguins were very afraid, and you can smell the way they just smell afraid. I don't know how to explain that, but it's overwhelming. And then you look down this corridor, and you can see the blue pools here, but that corridor would have been full of boxes, thousands and thousands of these cardboard boxes. And in each box, there was 3 birds. And you see all the people here, right? Well, this is weeks after the event, but this is what I came into, just these boxes with no running water, no electricity, and no volunteers. And I just thought to myself, like, how are we going to do this? What are we going to do? I was immediately completely overwhelmed. And then
And then what?
And Jay said,
Was that it? Did you?
and Jay was overwhelmed too when he first got there too, remember?
So I was just like so out of my mind. And then Mariette's just walking me through this giant train facility, which is about 5 foot long, football fields large. And she was telling me, and we're going to get the electricity set up here, and the water's going to go there, and these are going to be your wash bays, and this is going to be a dry. And it was all just imagination, right? Because it was just the bones of this building that had been decommissioned. So we had to set everything up from the scratch. And then once I went over Mariette where everything was going to go and how she was going to get it there, I started focusing on how were we going to feed these birds and get them hydrated, because they hadn't eaten for some of them almost a week already. And penguins physiologically, they can go for a long time without food and water. As a consequence of their biology, they go through a catastrophic molt. So they'll stand on an island for a month without food or water, molt all their feathers out, and then come back. So they have fat reserves, and they have the ability to be dehydrated much longer than most seabirds that we work with. So we had a little bit of leeway with time, but not a lot. And then they started funneling volunteers over in shifts, and some of them didn't know what they were doing and some did. And so we assessed them, and we just started trying to feed the birds in sections. And I think the first day we did hydrate about maybe 1,000 or 2,000 birds. That's all we could manage. And then the second day we hydrated twice as many. And then the third day we hydrated twice as many. And I think by the end of the 5th day, all the birds had been hydrated and maybe a quarter of the birds had been fed. So we were on this 5-day feeding and hydration cycle when we first started. And that was just freaking me out because I knew the birds would be losing condition, and we needed to get them fed every day, and we needed to get them hydrated every day in order for them to be cared for properly.
So, and then Barbara, one of the things that I know is a big deal about this is that when IFA put out the call, there was folks coming from all over the world, and I think there was like 59 different organizations that sent people.
Yeah.
How was that so impactful to have all these great minds that had, some of them had worked with penguins in their aquariums and such, but can you talk about, you know, sort of that teamwork element of it?
It was pretty amazing, actually. It's an amazing aspect. Right away, so I think we had 15 people between the International Bird Rescue Team and the IFA team. IFA was there with us every day. Sarah and Sally Hamilton and a number of others who were doing logistics for us. They were, you know, supporting the team, getting a hot meal in there every day. That 15 pretty much stayed top, start to finish. But we knew it wasn't enough. So they put out a worldwide call to zoo and aquaria. And knowing that we would get people who were used to managing animals and people who were used to managing people. And we could bring that mid-level manager in who could help us manage volunteers, but also who had the experience in managing the animals. And without exception, they were amazing. Like every zoos, aquarium, Diane, I think you're on, and that's how you got there. And Disney's Animal Kingdom sent 3 groups of 3, and they were, Mark loves the Disney people, I know, because they just say, yeah, that's a little, you'd compliment them, they'd say, it's a little Disney magic. Like they just embodied.
There was one of the Disney people
workers.
that stayed on longer than any of them. Her name was Gail, and she was in charge of thawing out the fish. And she had to thaw out fish for 15,000 birds every day. And she had her own department. And she could thaw those fish out to perfection.
Like nobody. Yeah.
If she
because
had
you didn't want them to get thawed out too fast, they'd get mushy. And
if they were frozen, they would kill the birds.
These people were amazing. And they'd stay for 2 or 3 weeks, and then a new group of 3 would come from somewhere else. Singapore Zoo and the Netherlands. And the Dutch people, of course, could speak Afrikaans, or close enough that they could understand each other. So that was fun. And people from literally around the world. I think you're right. 57 or 59 organizations. There were 110 different people, I think, in that group, or 114, something like that. Huge number of people that rotated through in those 3 months. And then we kept that core team at 15. Yeah.
That's great.
You know, there's one other point to that, Russ, and that is that I think Mark and you and Jay were talking early on about, you know, that these group of people were used to managing captive groups of penguins, many of them, and how that was going to be different. We had different protocols because we had a different end result, and that was to release these birds. And without fail, you know, you guys explained to them why the protocols were different. They stepped right in line and were like, absolutely, we're working for you, whatever you say.
They weren't used to handling wild penguins and force feeding
them. Yeah.
These penguins were, when I said I smelled fear, they were terrorized. They were absolutely terrorized. And every time somebody went to handle them, they felt like they were going to be eaten. They didn't know that we were trying to help them. And it took about a week or 2 to get the majority of these penguins to be used to being handled. They'll still bite the heck out of you and draw blood, but they knew what to do after about a week or 2, and they were much easier to handle, and they were much easier to force feed. But as it was, we could only train a few people a day at a time so that we didn't, you know, aspirate the penguins or cause any damage in their handling. And then we also had to figure out which people could manage, because these birds were strong and tough and difficult. And you never knew who was going to make it or not. And so you had to train as many people as you could every day. And it was a constant grind, basically, to get new people in and to train them. And it wasn't until the international groups came in and we could train them on how to do our process, then they could start training their own groups of volunteers. And so we would assign, right. And so we would assign an international team one of these hallways. And some of the pictures before showed you one of these rooms that were cordoned off by tarps, but there were 5. So there were about, you know, 7,000 birds, you know, or 3,000 birds in each one. And that's a lot of birds to manage every day, hydration and feeding and everything else. It was incredible how we were able to build on just a few volunteers the first few days, and then incorporate this into having over 1,000 volunteers come in a day.
Well, and I think it's
Okay.
important to remember too is that the bulk of the birds went to Salt River, and I think there was 16,000 at total, and then Sand Cobs was at Tableview had the rest of them.
Yeah, they had
that
about,
was a very small center over there.
They had around 4,000 or 5,000 at Sand Cobb, and then around 15,000 to 16,000 at Salt River.
Yeah, and I also just want to talk about just quickly that this is in South Africa going through apartheid, which had just ended in '94, and just 6 years in, the cultural shifts in Cape Town, because I remember taking a flight in and then taking a taxi to Salt River, and as I was driving out of the airport, there were shanty towns everywhere. There had been a huge shift, in people's living conditions. Going back there 20 years later or 17 years later when we visited, it really had changed. But going in there, it was like, wow, you could just feel like the country was still in the midst of change. And I do remember that politically, or just feeling that there were some folks that were in communities that were saying, hey, we barely have anything to eat, but you're feeding the penguins. And so I just want to mention that, because it
or huge money being spent on them.
That had to do with PR and outreach, and also the realization that, in countries that are third world countries, the amount of resources you put towards saving wildlife has to be balanced with the equity with the most impoverished populations in that country. And that was a lot of work that we had to do. One of the things I did notice, though, was that many of the non-whites in South Africa started volunteering, especially towards the middle of the spill, towards the end. And when I started volunteering or working with Sand Cobb in '94, there were very few non-European descent people volunteering or working with this rescue effort that were not paid. And in this Salt River spill, we had many thousands of all types of South Africans come in, and especially the Cape Colored people, which is it's a distinct community within South Africa, and anyway, everybody came, even tourists that would come and volunteer. So it was a much more open system by then, and you could see that even though there was some politics, that the different strata of the nation were concerned for their wildlife, and they came in to volunteer as well, which hadn't happened before to the level that it did on this spill.
Cool. I think it's a good time to switch to talk about some of the feeding strategies. I know one of the things that you folks are trying to get away from is force feeding penguins. And maybe you can talk about that, Barbara, Mark. I'm just going to show some slides of some of the penguins that awaited.
It probably should go to Mark, but before he talks, I should say we were looking at the chat, and Susie Kostowski was writing a little chat on here that says that Gail Sierpinski from Mystic Aquarium was handling fish when Susie Kostowski from Disney's Animal Kingdom, we love Disney's Animal Kingdom and Mystic Aquarium and all the rest, arrived, and I took over for her. She had it amazingly well organized. While I was there, we went from moving 7 to 9 tons of fish daily, if memory serves. Well, I know that our biggest day we thought out 10 used 10 tons of fish, so that's probably right on.
Gail was so competent with her team that I didn't keep track of how many fish. I just was like, great, we have fish. That's all I cared about.
As long as we had it. Mark, you should talk about feeding, but also about the lack of fish.
So when you first start feeding wild-caught adult penguins, it's a very stressful thing. The birds are panicky. They take the fish and they bite it. And then there's guts and blood everywhere, and they don't eat the fish. Like this bird here is already going through swallowing the fish on its own. The penguins won't even swallow the fish on their own. You get it in their mouth, they'll spit it back out. They're so terrorized. So it's extremely stressful, and it's really hard work and persistent work. And that's why the fish can't be too mushy. If the fish are mushy, you can't force feed them. They just go everywhere, all over the bird's face. So, and the birds will just mash it up. So there's very specific handling techniques that are really difficult to feed these birds, and they have to be fed every day, and at least 2 or 3 fish. And so the idea was to get away from hand feeding and force feeding and getting into voluntary feeding. And that's a process. And so Mariette Hopley had designed a feeding box. And there's the box right there. This were the people from Brittany that worked in the Erica spill
France.
that came over from France to help us with the penguins. And this box had and you see all the penguins are lined up. And so when they open the one side, all the penguins shuffle in, and then you close it and you feed each penguin 3 fish and 1 fish that has vitamins and minerals in it to make sure they have. This is also a great time when you have only a finite number of birds within the box that you can assess the bird's condition. So birds that were too thin or dehydrated or were weak or anemic would be pulled out and taken to the ICU unit. So this was a great time to evaluate them in small, discrete numbers. But in order for the birds we have to condition the birds, wild birds, to an artificial environment, to being comfortable with humans, and also to understanding how this box works. And that takes, I think, in totality, 2 weeks. 2 weeks to get the penguins used to people, and then a week to get them used to people, and then a week to get them used to this box. So before they line up on their own voluntarily, this looks so easy, you have to herd them and push them from the back. And that is a massive effort in itself. And a lot of people who aren't familiar with this methodology would prefer to just grab a penguin, put it in their lap, and force feed them.
So stressful.
But it's just too stressful on the animal. And so, of course, our goal is to minimize the stress, because if they're not stressed out, their immune systems are better, they're functioning better, they're going to gain weight faster. So we really got all these boxes made up and used them to feed all 15,000 birds at some point. And anyway, it's a very unique feeding system that works specifically for penguins that we don't use for any other species.
And after a couple of weeks of using the penguin boxes and getting them all trained, finally we got to a point where every animal in house got fed by 6 o'clock in the evening. And then we could have like Fishy Sue go around with a bucket of fish, free feeding, literally without the box. And if a bird looked interested, you got to hold that fish till it's halfway down the gullet. You really do. If they're interested and they want to get it, they'll eat it, but you're kind of supporting it a little bit. And so she'd just go around offering fish to whoever was interested. But they had already had fish that day. So
you trained them well, because by the time I got there in early August, they were paying attention. So I appreciate that.
And so many got fat. Some of them, as Mark said, it induced a catastrophic molt in some of them.
Right. There was a couple of them that definitely would have to waddle to get into the pool. I think you had to help them at some point.
And the molters are really, really hormonally aggressive. So you get bit a lot more by the molters. They're like sumo wrestlers, and they'll bite. And all the scars I have on my hands are from this spill.
So just moving outside even more, the pools that were set up.
We should talk about the washroom. So
we could go back to the washroom.
Yeah, because they can't go outside until they've been washed, right? So so we had to set up washrooms, and I took people that committed to volunteer for a week or 2. And I would train them to wash a penguin. It took 2 to 3 people, normally 2 people as a team, to wash 1 penguin. And we didn't have any kind of expectation on how many birds we could wash in one day. But we had 2 very large bathroom areas. If you can imagine, like a locker room size bathroom, they were pretty big. So we set them both up, wash station 1 and wash station 2. And we had about, I want to say, upwards of 40 people washing per shift, and there was 2 shifts a day. And we didn't, because we knew penguin physiology by this point and their requirements, we didn't need to rinse them, because we knew they would rinse themselves out pretty quickly, because they're tough and their feathers are really tough, and they have this underlying layer of fat tissue that other seabirds don't have. So we knew we just had to wash them all and get most of the oil off. So we started washing and training people, 1 at a time, 2 at a time. And we slowly built up our team to be upwards of 40 people a day per shift. So that's 2 shifts a day. So upwards of 80 people a day would come into the wash teams. And they would just come directly to the wash basins, because if they didn't, they would get sucked into feeding and cleaning, and they'd already been trained to wash. So we started washing, and we only started washing, the first day was maybe 20 birds, 30 birds. And at the very peak of our ability to manage the system that we've designed, with the flow of the birds and their feeding, everything else, I think one day we got upwards of 650 birds washed. But for me, that was just bonus. My goal was to get 500 birds washed in a day. And when we did that, I had a little party, because I didn't think we'd be able to pull it off. And I have to tell you, having worked with so many other species, no other species that I've worked with would be able to withstand the rigors and dehydration and neglect that these penguins did and still survive. So I kept thinking we're going to get a Newcastle's outbreak or a avian malaria outbreak, or the birds are going to starve. And I didn't have confidence that we could pull it off. So I was like skating on thin ice, and I was just manic. I was manically being positive to encourage everybody to do this great thing that we could all do if we all put all of our effort into it. But I'd go home every night and cry a little bit thinking there's no way we can do this. But then I'd pull myself together the next day and just make believe that we could do it. And we actually did. And that's what was crazy about it, is when we finally got 500 birds washed in a day, I honestly couldn't believe it. I was just in awe at what the people had bought into. They bought into my storyline, and they actually made it come true, which was really amazing.
That's awesome. And then moving outdoors, because we kind of skipped ahead of here a little bit. I think it's important to talk about the pools that were set up. And I think this is a small pool. I remember one of the pools looked like it was an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and you get about 200 penguins in there. And it was like you could barely see them. They were splashing around so much.
We had two types of pools. We had these pools, which we called wading pools. So every pen had about 2,000 to 3,000 birds in it. And that pen, it was like a little beach set up with their little wading pool where they could come in and out of the water as they wanted to. That was mostly for hydration purposes. And then we would march all the penguins into a solid-sided square pool, and that would have little ramps for them to get in and out of, but we would push them all in there, and we would force them to be in the water starting for 30 minutes a day. And then once they could handle 30 minutes a day without getting cold or hypothermic, then we put them in for 45 minutes a day, and then 50 minutes a day, and then an hour a day. And after they could be in there for an hour or longer, that's when we tested them for waterproofing for release. So we had two types of pools outside, a series of these larger freestanding square-sided pools, and that were very deep, about 3 or 4 feet deep. And then we had these little wading pools in all their pens.
And we were constantly cleaning them. I do remember that because that
was the job. You should remember.
Yeah, I was a pool boy.
But have you seen one penguin in the little wading pools? Not one. They just didn't go over real big.
They would go in them in the morning or after they ate.
Yeah, but
their little
they didn't spend a lot of time in there.
And that's why we had to force them into the other.
That's why we had mandatory swim supervisors.
Mandatory swim
Yep.
supervisors.
And I mean, that was their job. They herded their birds into the big Olympic-sized pools, and timed them. So it's more time than it was yesterday, and more number of times in the pool than yesterday, and more minutes per time than yesterday. And 5, 6, 7 days they had their waterproofing up.
I think I have some of the schematics for the outdoor pool system, but I mean the outdoor pen system. But this is just one pen, and I think we had like maybe 10,
right.
10 pens like that.
Oh, I thought there were 13 pens.
Yeah.
And 12 of the big pools.
Yeah.
But and I was just funny the things you remember. I was just looking at the far corner of this picture, looking at those outhouses, those porta potties. We didn't really. They came kind of late in the show, didn't they? And I remember a thunder and lightning storm that we ended up going in for because we.
That was the only place you could shelter in place.
Yes, it was like pouring rain on.
Well, the other thing that I think is a good thing to talk about, Mark and Barbara, is that if you remember right, a lot of the penguins, they were escape artists. And I remember sitting there one day and looking, and there was 3 of them, and they were getting on top of each other to try to get out of these pens, because you can see like this is pretty open here, but there were some places where they would really work to get out of.
If you go back to the slide with the round pools, what they would do, we would come in every morning and have to do penguin roundup, because there would be penguins that were running around the facility that had escaped. Now these birds so what they would do is the penguins would crowd into a corner, and then the other penguins would jump on their backs, and as they were on the backs of the other birds, they could put their flippers over the edge of the pools and wiggle their way out with their claws. So we would get about 20 to 30 birds escaped every night that would figure out how to do this. And we'd have to go around and chase them. And, on the other sides of these tarps, there was just weird tunnels and things through this train yard, and we'd have to get down in the tunnels and catch these penguins, and their little heads would pop up, and we'd have to go chase them down. And they even escaped the outdoor pens occasionally as well, and we'd have to go around the perimeter and follow their footprints through the very large train yard and through these outbuildings and find them. And there were stories of penguins that had escaped our checks and had actually wandered down through the drainage system and got back out into
the train station.
They had escaped. So we lost a few that managed to self-release, I guess you'd call it. It was fun.
I love that we have people that were there on with us, Mark, and I wish we had time for everybody to tell their story, because I bet you it would be interesting. There are stories we've never even heard.
Oh, so many stories, and getting the supplies. Getting supplies to because we had to feed thousands of volunteers, give them water. We had a first aid station with nurses specifically for the penguin casualty people. People got bit in the nose. Nose piercings were a big deal back then. Lips were split. Noses were split. Eyes were nobody lost an eye, but there was eye damage. So we had a lot of penguin related injuries, and there were so many people. We had the boxes that we used to carry these birds in. There was a mountain of boxes. It was like 2 stories tall and almost a block long. And we had a mountain of towels and donated blankets. And we were always running out of zip ties or these mats. Everything had to be sourced and provided. And Mariette Hopley was our logistic person, and she worked with IFA to source all these things. And so that gave the IBRC team the ability to focus on the management of the birds.
We just did bird and
people. Yeah. And that's really what we did. And that was our expertise that we lent them. And we coordinated with the other groups to get everything we needed for these birds. But it was a daily chore to keep them fed, to source the fish, to provide the things that we needed for the volunteers, like these jumpers and gloves and everything else, and get them done. This bird's getting checked for release.
Well, and I also love, Mark, that like you and I were talking before this event, the government actually had to up the quotas for the commercial fishermen to catch more fish than normal because there were none on the market.
Yeah.
We used them all for the birds. And then they said, guess what? We're not paying for any more fish, and that's when IFA really stepped up and said, we got this no matter what. And they were almost $1 million in, all told.
Yeah.
Before they knew they were going to get some reimbursement.
Keeping the birds fed, that would be a challenge with that many birds anywhere in the world.
Absolutely. And look, now today, I don't know if we could have done it today.
Right. And South Africa met the challenge of supplying the fish and changing the regulations and doing what was right by the wildlife, which is just amazing. Absolutely.
Yeah, the country really got behind so much of this, and I was going to switch now to there's Barbara working blood samples.
Now, Barbara, you were looking for avian malaria. What were you looking for?
I was, and of course, Mark, you want to talk about your role as avian malaria specialist or your non-avian malaria specialist?
So I'll quickly say why it was important. So the 2 concerns for this many penguins in captivity on land, on the mainland, was they would contract Newcastle's, which they were not really immune to, or avian malaria, which they're not really immune to. Avian malaria is borne by mosquitoes as a vector, and there aren't many mosquitoes in the saltwater environment or on islands with no fresh water. So penguins don't normally encounter avian malaria. So when they get it, they subsequently suffer a high mortality. So we had to make sure that they weren't getting malaria. And in order to make sure that our facility wasn't producing mosquitoes, I had to run around with a pickaxe on all my breaks and all my lunches before and after work and make sure there was no standing water, because all the pools we used also had a lot of overflow, and the overflow had to be channeled away from the penguins without any of it standing in puddles or being stagnant. So I was on like mosquito patrol for a couple months. It was fun. It was a little break.
So yes, that's what I'm looking for.
So you're looking for,
But it's funny because in our own clinics, we were just talking about Babesia in California, and there is a pathogenic variety there. But in South Africa, they told us that the Babesia there is not pathogenic to these birds, but on microscope, it looks very, very similar to malaria.
Oh.
And, you can see these. I personally made the first 5,000 blood slides and reviewed them myself. You see, there's only one microscope there. This is probably 10 o'clock at night. And I look a little tired, okay? Gosh, I've aged in 20 years. Okay, but then we were smart. And let me tell you, they have an amazing medical school there. And we tapped into it, and we got the med students down from the university, and they brought these beautiful $5,000 Olympus scopes, and pretty soon we had 10 microscopes and, pictures of malaria, and which is, by the way, caused by Plasmodium, and Babesia up on the wall, what did it look for and the differences. And they did all our screening for us. And then on the other side of this room, this was the ICU vet room, we did, for those, I see a lot of rehabbers on here and a lot of people that know us and a lot of people who do what we do. And that normally in a perfect world, we would be taking blood on intake. We take it before wash, before release, a couple times in between. Okay, so I get there and I'm a few days in because I backfilled for Jay in Berkeley for a few days before I got to go. And I'm like, okay, where's the blood work happening? Jay's like, yeah, we're not doing that. I said, how are you picking birds? Just like 6 months before that at Ericasville. He goes, the old fashioned way. I said, well, what's that? I'd never heard. We always did blood work. What do you mean the old fashioned way? He said, we open their mouth and we look at their tongue. And if it's, glossy and pink and they're not dehydrated, well, that was Valeria Rapalo's job. She's a vet. She and Rodolfo Silva went around. They picked birds for wash after you, Mark, instructed them on what they were looking for. So no blood work. And finally, we're starting to look at the first birds getting ready for release and being graded. And
I think we lost you there for
we're not going to come back if we don't have the logistics and the resources to take blood from them. They're going to go out the door anyway. You got me back now?
Yeah, you're back.
Yep.
You hear me? Okay. And he said, we're not going to hold them back. If you can't bleed them, we're going to go ahead, and if you can't take blood, we're going to go ahead and release them. And to me, being the biologist, I was like,
yeah.
oh, no, you're not.
And Barbara, this is where you and I worked together to make sure that we didn't release any birds before they were bled, despite what we were told. We made sure they were all bled. And what was one of the interesting aftermaths of this was that we'd taken all this data. So some of these birds had been banded previously and had been through several other oil spills, or a couple. And then all the birds went from flipper plastic bands to federal bands, and that was all recorded and kept. And all those records, all these bleed records and malaria records and everything else went over to SANCOB. And so I actually stayed an additional month in South Africa just to make copies of all those records so that IBRC would have them and also SANCOB could have them in perpetuity. And it wasn't until 4 years ago that I found out that those records had been lost in South Africa, but I had maintained my copy. And so I was able to bring those records back to the University of Cape Town so they could correlate some of these birds and some of these numbers with birds that were still alive and breeding on the islands today.
That was huge. The University of Cape Town Avian Demography Unit started before the Apollo C spill, but that's when, after Apollo C, they started really, every one of those birds that got released was banded. So they really had a close watch on those. And, okay, I love it when Jay says, there's a bird in here with a flipper from Apollo C, a flipper band from Apollo C. He recognizes me. I know he remembers me. Did he say that or did he not?
He did. And we did have a couple, yeah.
Okay, he swore they remembered him. And, but there were 2 and 3 time loser birds. They literally had been in Cordillera, Dyer Island, Apollo C and Treasure. And that, the value of banding every single bird, and Phillip Island folks came and helped with that. And I keep forgetting to say, we worked so closely with the trustee, the government trustee there, Cape Nature Conservation, they were called at the time. they're the ones we haven't even talked about, the preemptive capture of almost 20,000 birds off Dyer Island.
We were moving in that direction
Oh,
right
we're
now.
going
You
there,
read my mind.
But it was Cape Nature, really, that step by step, they were wonderful. And they said to us, you have almost 90% of the Robben Island population in your care in Salt River. Most of them came to us. And, you know, the idea that we might have a disease outbreak, the Newcastle, the Plasmodium turning into malaria, whatever it was, we were terrified that, I mean, just think of the loss of genetic diversity at that point. So, Mark, you took that seriously, as did Heidi Stout. Everybody did. I think that was really when we started saying this is some serious stuff, and the population was already in peril. And Cape Nature did a great job.
We rarely get to work with a species where we're impacting the actual population in the wild. And so this was not only important for the species, for us to rescue as many birds as possible, because their numbers have been declining for the last 25 years. And it's important to collect those blood samples and get the release data and the weights and everything else, because they just are never going to have 20,000 penguins again at one time in captivity to get that kind of information. And it helps to understand their physiology and their biology and get a baseline for those things.
Yeah, I mean, really, when Jay said we're not going to hold birds back if you can't get them take blood from all of them, I was like, you know, but aside from my own personal ego being wrapped up there, I just thought, you know, the loss of losing a chance, who in the world has ever taken blood from 20,000 penguins? It hasn't been done before or since.
Right.
So that was huge. And then we just, about 10% we'd hold back every time that weren't quite ready, blood-wise, weren't quite ready for release. You know, so the next morning after we bleed them, and if they were approved for release, then my team would take blood from them, and then we'd spin the blood, and then the next day I'd take those records home, and anybody who didn't meet the criteria, we'd circle in red. The next day they're calling off numbers. Oh, pull that one aside. He goes back a few days because he needs just more time.
Barbara, do you want to talk about the relocation effort?
I'm sorry. Oh no, I mean, yeah, you're welcome to, Mark.
Sure. So one of the amazing things about this was that there were actually 40,000 penguins impacted, but only 20,000 were oiled and needed rehabilitation, because they literally fenced off Dasson Island to keep the birds that were breeding on the interior parts of the island from getting to the coast where the oil was. And then they corralled and boxed up and transported 20,000 birds off the island by helicopter. And then at night, they shipped them in cattle trucks from the Cape region all the way over to Port Elizabeth, which is on the other side of the continent, down in southern South Africa. So one of the things that you'll notice is these are the only boxes that have a peak on top that we've ever utilized. And the reason why there's a peak on top of each roof of each of the tops of the cardboard carriers is so that they don't get stacked on top of each other. Because in 1994, during the Apollo C, they actually stacked the birds on top of each other and put them in containers with no air holes. So they lost 5,000 birds in transport. So they learned a really valuable lesson about transporting birds and making boxes that would not lend themselves to stacking. So they were much more careful in keeping airflow between the boxes and between the layers of birds, so that never happened again. And of course it didn't. And so they were able to move these 20,000 penguins from one side of the continent to the other. And here, this is great.
And no loss of life in transport,
right.
Like Apollo.
And the whole theory was that by moving these 20,000 birds, then they wouldn't have to be, because they weren't convinced we could save 20,000 oil birds, let alone 40,000. So their feeling was that the birds had a better chance of being transported across country, and then it would take them, they thought, about 2 weeks to swim back. And what they did was they put radio telemetry devices on 3 of the penguins, Peter, Pamela, and Percy. And they tracked their progress back to the island, hoping that they could clean the island before the penguins came back. So these 3 birds represented the 20,000 cohort. And every night on the news, on all the news stations, they would cover where the penguins were at what time. So the whole country was really invested in how this whole operation was working and making sure the birds didn't come back to an oiled island. So it was the first time anything like this had been done with transport, a preemptive strike to keep the birds from getting oiled. And it was the first time they'd been radio telemetry in such a way to monitor their progress in the open ocean. And it was the first time that they'd ever had 20,000 birds in care. So it was a lot of firsts for the world. It was a global thing.
And 90.3% release rate.
Yes, our release rate was absolutely phenomenal. And I remember crying the first time I went to the beach on one of these releases. And I think it was the 1,000th, it was like a group of maybe 300 birds or whatever were being released, but it was like the number 1,000 was being released. Or maybe it was 1,000 in a day. I can't remember. All I know was
I think it was 1,000 in a day.
It was 1,000 birds in one day, and we'd gotten to 5,000 released. That's what it was. And of course, I was working with the birds in the facility, and I didn't take the time to go on a release because I was so manically trying to keep the birds in house alive.
We've seen them,
and so I couldn't take the time out to go on a release until after I felt that I would be successful in saving the birds in house, or I and the volunteers. And so I went on the release that included 1,000 birds, and I think it was a 5,000 bird total release after that day. And I just cried. I just cried, and a huge burden came off my shoulders because I actually realized we've released 1/3 of these birds, and I can see the rest of them in house and know how well they're doing. And I actually thought, my God, we're actually going to pull this off. I just couldn't believe it. And that must have been into month 2, right? So we were into month 2 before I actually believed we could pull it off. And then, as this sign says, or the wording, the pink dots were to track the birds for about 1 to 2 weeks. So they were literally spray painted, and the little dye would stay on the feathers for 1 to 2 weeks, and they would know where the birds went from the release site to monitor their.
Luckily, the biologists saw, I mean, even within 10 days, they saw 2 pink spots already on the nest, together again. And, it was really designed to help them. It didn't affect their waterproofing. And, it was really so biologists could right away see resightings because they're very actively on the beach watching, looking for tag numbers.
One thing to note was this oil spill happened at the beginning of their breeding season. So there were baby chicks and eggs on the nest. And so some of those young chicks were brought into captivity. Some were not because they didn't think they would be able to manage to raise, thousands of tiny baby chicks. But not all the birds had bred yet. And it was still at the beginning of their season. So it created a little more stress on the birds, but they recovered really well.
It's interesting because I think we actually hand reared the 500 and up chicks, more chicks, and released more chicks than normally make it through that first year of a wild cycle for Robben Island. So that was really good. Yeah,
it was really good. So many great spin-off stories on this rescue.
One of the things that if you haven't been back to South Africa or traveled there, not only do we recommend it because the people and the scenery there is extraordinary and it's such a warmth of hospitality. Visit Boulders Beach around from Cape Town. It's where the penguins actually live, and they live among the sunbathers and the swimmers and things like that. And I think the water's a little bit warmer on that side, if I remember right, too.
Not much. You have to go to Port Elizabeth for it to
I was so excited in 2002. I got to go to a meeting there, and I was back in 2018 for the International Penguin Conference. But in 2002, I think I was back for a meeting, and Jay and I went to Boulders Beach, and we actually saw abandoned birds there.
Wow.
And, I'm not sure that Sandcop bans every bird or not, if they're not in a catastrophic oil spill. So I was excited. I just chose to believe they were some of our birds.
Well, Boulders Beach is a beautiful neighborhood, beautiful town, and it's got these huge granite boulders that tumble right into the sea with white pristine sand. And the penguins actually moved into Boulders in the last 30 years and started breeding in these very expensive yards, these very big homes, very expensive real estate. And the penguins kind of made themselves at home, and the local people integrated the penguin colony into their own community and there's signs and fences up, and they really do protect
Go slow. Yeah,
their
watch for the
penguins.
penguins.
They-
Well,
penguins
Check under your car.
yeah.
yep. It's turned into quite a tourist attraction, but it's beautiful to see, and highly recommend it. Can one of you talk about? I mean, I think one of the concerns going forward is that Sandcob is really working to try to take care of these penguins because the numbers are just
Plummeting.
dwindling to the
Plummeting.
point. Yeah.
Yeah, and a number of years ago, they started the Chick Stream project when there clearly was no longer enough, nests were failing because there just wasn't enough fish in the ocean for them. And as
That's
I
due
said,
to overfishing.
yeah, exactly. Is that what did you say because of overfishing, Mark?
Overfishing and the climate change, I would say probably. Yep.
Exactly. And they have continued with the Chick Stream project. They have at least 2 satellite centers now, and outside of Cape Town, which is great. They're doing, much more aggressive bolstering projects, but they're also, I think, have other projects that are meant to help the conservation of the species, which is delightful to see.
And I do know that they have received even more support from the community, and they did open up at least I think Tableview has a brand new center.
They have a brand new center out there. Yep.
Right. Yeah. So we applaud them at every turn because they really are holding on to something that's dear to our heart.
And it was delightful to just have their rehab manager, who's now their oiled wildlife response manager, but she was rehab manager. Nikki Strander just came and interned with us for a few weeks at our Northern California Center.
Right.
So, isn't that nice? And we love to have opportunities to share, to just share what we have. That was something Jay he always gave it away if people asked. And so I was super excited that Nikki got a chance to come over and work with our folks, and just work with some different species too, mers and other seabirds. So yeah, that part was great.
And I just wanted to tip our cap to Marriott Hopley, who was, she was the go-to person in so many ways at that spill. And when we visited there in 2017, she rolled out the red carpet and helped us celebrate Jay Holcomb, and remembering him for some of the people that were impactful for him in South Africa. So I just wanted to say that.
And I also wanted to say, historically speaking, what motivated Jay to respond to the Apollo Sea in 1994 was his experience on the Exxon Valdez in 1989. Was that 89 or 88? 89. He was so overwhelmed logistically and felt so isolated and alone and without any kind of real support, that when he saw the newsreels that were coming in 1994 of the Apollo Sea, it really spoke to him on a very visceral level. And he really just wanted to go over there and just help relieve some of the stress and pressure that he knew those people were suffering because he'd gone through it himself. And so that was the motivating force, was what our experience as International Bird Rescue in the Exxon Valdez and the lessons that we learned. He wanted to take that to South Africa and apply those lessons and support those people to help them get through it and let them know that they weren't going through this huge tragedy on their own. And so that's how that's how it all started, really. It was from our experience at the Exxon Valdez informed Jay's motivation to help them in 94. And then luckily Sandcob was open to, learning from us, the washing techniques, rinsing techniques, taking the blood, all these things that we had learned were vital for our species. They were more than willing to incorporate into caring for their own.
That's good to remember. One of the things that I wanted to just say, it's really important and especially in the communications, and that's what I do with bird rescue a lot, is to have great photographs. And John Rissa was the ace photographer, if you want to call it that, on the ground. I think he was there for most of the 3 months. IFA had worked, I can't remember exactly how they connected with him, but
he contracted with him often for special projects.
Right. And he was a remarkable photographer. Every day I look at treasure still pictures, and I'm just like, wow. And this is back before digital, and you know, there was very little. I don't know. Did somebody have a phone back then that had a camera on it? I don't think so. So
Nope.
it really relied on a man, and with a great eye and a great human touch to capture this spill. And I just wanted to acknowledge him because his photos live on, even though he's no longer with us. And the other thing I wanted to, Mark has alluded to it, is Jay really set the stage for this in so many ways, and his openness to share information and to engage people. And I know Valeria has told a story about meeting Jay. Valeria's down in Brazil, and just that willingness to share information about how to save birds in a spill really left a mark on the world. And I know we all miss him, but I just wanted to say thanks, Jay, for bringing us all together.
Thank you, Jay.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I was just looking, I think Susie just wrote on the Association of Zoo and Aquariums, the AZA, now has a program called SAFE, Saving Animals from Extinction, that coordinates efforts among organizations and agencies to conserve severely impacted species. The African Penguin SAFE program works with SANCOB and others, including providing artificial nest boxes. Read the call for participants documents in this chat. You guys can access it. She's got a link there. Thank you, Susie. And thank you for all those wonderful comments. I'm not sure we have time to read them all, but thank you.
If there's some more questions, we do have some time. If people want to stick around, there's still 60 people in the attendees. Do you want me to go through and see what I?
Yeah.
Yeah. If anybody has any questions, or we had 3 months worth of stories.
Is Diane going to talk about just how she decided to write the book?
She's waiting for you to ask her to.
Oh, well, then she should probably step up and let's talk about it.
I'd be happy to share that. I guess I'm not seeing video, but that's all right.
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay. So yeah, the book was, you know, a labor of love. It was my love letter to the penguins and to the 12,500 extraordinary volunteers who arrived and just showed up to help, and to the amazing leadership team. And, you know, I started reading at age 5. I was always a voracious reader, and I always knew someday I'd write a book. I just had no idea what I'd write a book about. And I was in Cape Town. We were running room 2, Heather and I, for the beginning. And then I was over at SANCOB. And it was the most intense, overwhelming experience of my life, but by far the most rewarding. And I remember vividly getting on the plane to leave Cape Town to fly back to Boston after almost 3 weeks there. And about halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, I went, aha, this is what my book is going to be about, because this is the most incredible conservation story. And at that point, we didn't even know yet if it would be a conservation success story, because the first release happened, I think, the day we arrived home. But it just was such an extraordinary story of people coming together and collaborating and working together and you know, to save a species. And I said, this is a story that has to be shared with the world. And I was very fortunate, you know, 10 years later, finally I got around to it. And luckily Simon & Schuster's Free Press agreed that it was a story that had to be shared with the world. So that's how the book came about.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you for
Diane, did you have to go on a book tour? I'm interested. Did you do you still sell a lot of copies? I'm just interested. Do you have people calling you and talking to you still 20 years later?
You know, it's really been remarkable. So I did do not a huge book tour, and this was just as the publishing industry was changing. And so I was sitting here waiting, you know, I had a publicist at the house, and I'm waiting to hear about my book launch party. And, you know, because everybody has a book launch party. And finally, maybe, I don't know, a month and a half before, I call my agent or my editor, and I said, so when's the book launch party? And they said, oh, we don't do those anymore. Like, oh, crap.
Oh,
So I had to hold my own book launch party.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but it's really, I think the most rewarding thing, it's not like the copies aren't flying off the shelf. I mean, it still does sell copies. The hardcover is out of print, but the paperback is still in print. But I still, to this day, will occasionally receive an email or a letter or a message from someone who they read the book, and because of the book, because of this story, they were inspired to go to college for biology. Maybe 10 years after reading it, they read it as a 10-year-old, and now they're a biology major. Or I remember telling the treasure story once, and there was a guy in the audience. He was 32 years old. He said, I've always dreamed of working with penguins, but, you know, I'm too old. And I looked at him, I said, I didn't go back to college to do this until I was 32 years old. It's never too late. You are not too old. You can volunteer at the aquarium. And don't you know, like a week later, he was volunteering at the aquarium. He went back to college. And so he's working with penguins. So yeah.
Story.
So that to me is such a rewarding aspect of it, is hearing these stories from people that the book inspired them to either make a donation to Sand Cobb, go back to college, get involved in conservation somehow. And that was my mission in writing it, was sort of to, you know, make people aware of what's happening with penguins and hopefully inspire them to want to make a difference. And so, yeah, so it's been a very rewarding thing.
Well, thank you. One of the questions I was asked was how people that work with penguins in zoos or collections or aquariums, how working on this spill impacted them. And I will tell you, almost every single one of them had no idea how their little colony of captive bred penguins interrelated to their wild cousins. And they all were super inspired and actually were much more committed to conservation and integrating their populations with some kind of a conservation plan after being able to take these birds in captivity and release them back to the wild. It was a very impactful experience for all of them, because, you know, when you work with an in-house colony of birds, you know each individual, they all have personalities, but you also can't ever see them experience what it is to be a penguin in the wild, how to swim freely in an ocean, how to catch a wild fish, you know, in a natural setting. And so some of them made a commitment to segue into rehabilitation, or were just really inspired at the interconnection between these captive populations and the wild populations that they came from. And that was really something I hadn't thought of before, because growing up, I thought I'd always end up working in a zoo, and I ended up working in rehabilitation, which is much more suited to my personality. And so it was really amazing to see this transformation of thought process within people that are used to working with animals in an artificial setting, and how they wish that they could rehabilitate their birds and let them go into the wild again and be successful with that. Naturally, the birds that we were caring for had already been raised in the wild and were successful hunters and everything, which is a whole different level. But it was really inspiring.
I want to make a comment to that. I agree. And I think what it did for me, because we already were talking a lot about conservation at the aquarium, and we already had a connection with Sand Cobb. You know, Heather had been over there before, my colleague. But what it did for me was sort of seeing firsthand the suffering of these birds at the hand of humans, right? Because of human error. It just sort of galvanized me as well, and to want to do everything in my power to raise awareness to protect penguins. And so that was why when I left the aquarium 4 years later and I started my business, The Penguin Lady, my mission as the Penguin Lady is to raise awareness and funding to protect threatened and endangered penguins. And so as such, I donate 20% of my proceeds to various penguin rescue research and conservation groups. So from both my book and from every lecture and every appearance. And so SANCOB is one of the primary organizations that I support, but that's sort of become a lifelong mission for me because of the experience I had during the treasure oil spill rescue.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's awesome. Was there some more
Great.
questions that we could help answer? Barbara, did you see anything else that
I didn't say
know there's a
anything
lot
else except Deb Dyson texted me privately and said, what a great webinar. And she and Kurt would have absolutely been there, except their child was born that week.
That's right.
There's a question. Do you want to, Diane, to touch on, since you're the penguin lady, to touch on global populations of penguins around the world and how they're doing in general?
Sure. So, well, as you guys, I think, are all aware, not just the African penguin, but all penguin species are really in trouble. There are now, I would have said 18 penguin species, but just a few months ago, they now have determined that there are actually 3 separate species of rockhoppers and not 2 with a subspecies. So I now say 19 species. So 15 of the 19 are listed as vulnerable, threatened, or endangered. Their populations are crashing. Most penguin species have seen a 50 to 95% decline over the last 50 to 100 years. The African penguin in particular has had a 99% decline over the last 120 years. So I believe the population now is about 18,000 pairs. When we were all there 20 years ago, there were about 165, 170,000 individuals. So that's quite a dramatic crash in the population. The top threats, the top 2 threats, and you touched on this with the starvation, are overfishing of their food source and global warming. And with global warming, it has a lot of different impacts, but the primary thing, again, is it kind of moves these cold water currents where their food is, making it harder for them to get enough food to eat. So those are the primary threats to most penguin species throughout the Southern Hemisphere. And, you know, I always like to remind people that those are 2 things that each one of us actually has some power to do something about within our own actions and behaviors.
I also want to put a plug in for Diane. She's got some great TED Talks, and I recommend those highly if you want to not only inspire yourself, but other folks or students or classes or what have you. Those are great ways to have people connect to the concerns around penguins.
Thank you, Russ. And actually, I want to also, you know, the first one I did was about the penguin rescue. I was so nervous. I can tell when I watch it. I'm like, oh, I was so nervous. But I did one that I would even recommend more, and because I feature more of the volunteers. It was a talk that I did for Boston Talks. It was in the fall of, I think, 2017 or 18. It's on my website. It's Heroes was the theme for the night, and I'm the 3rd speaker of the night. And I think it's a little bit longer than my TED Talk, so I get to go into a little bit more detail. And so I would actually even recommend that one. And I believe it might be on the first page or on the video page of my website. But thank you very much for mentioning that.
Yeah, we'll look for that. I also just wanted to, I mean, we're starting to wrap up, but if there's other questions, do pop them into the chat window. I really didn't sort of introduce bird rescue that well, and I just wanted to mention that, you know, we've responded to over 225 spills. We still have a very active response team, and we're working with organizations and government agencies to not only help train folks just in case they do get oiled wildlife, whether it be in Alaska or Washington or even in California and elsewhere. And we also have not only connected with SANCOB over the years, but we actually work with IUCA as is it a 3rd tier response, Barbara, that in case that something happens down in South America, we would be called to help down there.
We're Tier 3 response for IUCA, our lovely partners and dear friends. Many, many years. We've worked lots and lots of spills with their folks around the world. We brought Valeria and Rodolfo with us on many spills after Treasure. And yeah, we are written into every Tier 3 contract. So if it becomes bigger than a regional response, we
on that. So the idea of an international response team specializing in seabirds was basically Jay's idea. And he brought that to IFAW, and his working with IFAW and proposing that to IFAW and saying, look, we can have a bigger impact for all of our organizations if we do this. That was really Jay's idea. We were actually doing it before we started working with IFAW. We went down to a spill in Argentina with no funding, Punta Tumbo, no funding, it was a shoestring budget. And we were actually creating pens out of driftwood and rocks down in Punta Tumbo. So this was Jay's baby in a way. And the work that we were able to accomplish came through his vision. And it would be nice to continue that goodwill effort internationally. There was one question, Barbara, about are there data that we collect during these big spills that were not shared? And no, all of the data that we collect.
No, not that weren't shared, that we refrained from taking because of the magnitude of the spill.
Oh, is it data? Okay. No, I think
I would agree.
I think we treated now you have to understand that penguins are a different bird than most birds. So birds are all highly evolutionarily divergent, and penguins are probably some of the most divergent species on the planet. So their evolutionary trajectory is at least 68 million years independent of other bird species. So we really treat bird species individually. So some birds require different levels of care. Penguins are almost like a mammal in the way that they can maneuver on land. They don't get secondary injuries from being on land, being out of the water, like many other bird species that we work with that are seabirds. They have fat reserves. They're tough and tenacious and resilient, much more. They're not fragile like many other bird species that we work with, at least with the protocols that we use. So no, we didn't bleed them every week like we do normally in our oil spills, partially because there were 20,000 of them, and partially because we knew that they didn't need it. They needed to be bled fundamentally, they needed to be bled prior to wash and then prior to release. And then if they were anemic at either of those checks, they would be bled additionally. Now, in an ideal world, we would have bled them at intake, but that wasn't the way this situation went because of the numbers. But then all of that information, all that data is also collected and correlated with their band numbers and moves along with them through the system. So I think we did all the same kinds of work that we would do normally. Now, during oil spills, we don't normally do fecals and those kinds of checks, because we're looking at birds that were here because of oiling, not because of malnutrition or some other unknown cause. So we treat them as healthy birds that only have been exteriorly oiled, and then they have the internal effects of oiling as well, which with penguins, they mitigate very quickly. They don't experience the same levels of hemolytic anemia that many other species would. So that's why we're a little more lax on how often we take blood on them.
Good
I hope that answers the question. Did I cover everything, Barbara?
From that question, I think so.
I also do want to mention too that the Bird Center, a lot of you folks are aware of us, but I just want to mention that we do have two full-time rehab centers. We've been working all the way through COVID. We have one in Los Angeles near the LA Harbor, which has been the site of a couple big spill responses. We have chronic oiling in Southern California near Santa Barbara and Ventura County from oil seep, natural oil seep. And so there's a lot of birds that do come in, and we have a center that is able to wash those birds and then get them back into the wild. Lots of grebes, Clarkson Westerns especially. And we also have a center in San Francisco Bay Area. It's closer to UC Davis, about 45 miles from San Francisco. And like I said, we've been open during COVID. We've been moving along pretty well, considering our volunteers have had to stay more at home. And we've been thankful there hasn't been a major spill where we'd have to really roll that out, that sort of that COVID protocol. Although we did have a small response in Alaska where we had to deal with some of that.
Very interesting times to do a spill during COVID, let me tell you.
Oh,
yep. That's a whole webinar right there.
Oh, that's a whole nother webinar.
But, you know, we really appreciate you showing up tonight. Doing
Absolutely.
these, everybody is on Zoom now, and to take an hour, hour and a half of your time on a Thursday night to learn more about this, we really appreciate it. And I know there's been a couple webinars. SANCOB had a really nice one in June. But we wanted just to share some of what we've learned, maybe a little bit more pointed on how we kind of became involved. But we really appreciate all your support, and feel free to check out the website. There are a couple virtual things that you can do to be supportive of bird rescue. There's a virtual 5K run. You can go bird walking. You can get your friends involved to help support us and get out and get some exercise. And then when you get that exercise, there's actually a way to become a member and get a cookbook so you can learn how to cook really good sweet treats. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. But thank you again. And
there was a question about flamingos, Barbara.
Oh,
that was I remember the flamingo event, but I didn't go. Did you go?
I did not, and we had Susan Gavasia there and some of our other responders. However, I happen to know someone on this call that might be more appropriate.
Well, I know what happened.
And let's allow her to talk. Let's see,
great.
Michelle can speak about it because she did I just unmuted you, Michelle. And nothing like putting you on the spot. You want to talk about how many responders we had in the flamingo event and what the event was?
Oh, okay. I think I'm here.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Okay, we sent 2 teams of 2, so we sent a total of 4 responders.
And this was to support SANCOB, right?
It was to support the flamingo response. We actually sent 2 responders to SANCOB, and we sent 2 responders to the University of Pretoria.
Was through AZA.
Yes.
And
So
what was the problem, Michelle? Can you speak about what the problem was?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so apparently there was a drought at Lake Louise. My memory of the names is bad, but apparently there was a drought happening at a lake where flamingos breed in South Africa. And what happened was the adults came in and they bred as normal, but this drought took away all of the food sources nearby, so that those babies were going to starve and die. So the Association of Avian Veterinarians in Southern South Africa put together a response and decided that they were going to save the young. The adults abandoned the young, and the babies were left to die. So they decided they were going to try to save those babies, and those babies were farmed out to a number of rehabilitators and universities throughout South Africa to raise.
Susie was saying Camphor's Dam, the lesser flamingos, and Susie, I was just trying to see if I could let her talk, but.
Well, I think this response actually was part of a legacy that we built with South Africa. So they were more than willing to ask for our help and rely on our expertise.
They didn't. The AVA did.
Right. Well, because.
Yeah. So Susie, do you want to speak about that? You were making a note. Oh, she's muted now, but I was asking her.
So Michelle, how did it go?
It went well. It was challenging because, the response was slow in starting. It lacked a centralized response.
Right.
One of the great things with an oil spill response is that there's generally a centralized response, and in this there was not a centralized response. So a whole bunch of different groups were trying to tackle the problem from a whole bunch of different angles. We were very happy with the help that we were able to give to the University of Pretoria, and certainly to work with our partners at SANCOB. And the birds that we were able to work with, we think that we worked with really well. I don't know how well we're going to be able to deal with drought, but that's an ongoing problem of a totally different variety.
We can't fix that?
How many birds did you were there in the total rescue effort, and how many did you work with?
I'm afraid I absolutely do not have those numbers.
Oh, you don't?
Maybe Susie is now connected. Maybe she can fill us in on that.
Yeah.
Hi, guys. Yeah, I did not actually go over to South Africa. I was working on another project at that point, but there were several people from AZA, and I really kind of pushed that a little bit, I have to confess. Lori Conrad, who is kind of a world expert on lesser flamingos and on managing and rearing them, was one of the leaders in that, and we sent several people over from AZA. And there were, as you say, several different facilities. I don't know the numbers of birds that were raised, but we kind of dispersed people to Sand Cobb. There was a rehab center in Kimberly, another center that mainly works with vultures, Vulpro, and that took on a lot of the flamingos. And so, you know, we really had people spread out all over the place to raise these chicks. And it was kind of a phased program of first getting the chicks up to, you know, kind of a feathered out and fledging age, but then getting them in a condition, as you did with the penguins, to be able to be released back to the wild. And they're now starting to record some of those birds, and there are people who work over there who observe these areas constantly and have been seeing these released birds that are over there. And I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of detail on it because I wasn't there, but it was an amazing effort. And I'm kind of hoping that somebody will do a webinar similar to this one at some point to kind of summarize it all.
For sure.
You know, we who work in zoo animal care, you know, I got into it for because I thought animals needed good care, and we're in it for welfare. But we realized pretty quickly that we had to be in it for conservation too, and that's really our main mission. When we work with these animals, you know, I had the privilege of working with the California Condor Recovery Program for many years. You know, so anytime we can get our hands on and help with stuff like that, it is absolutely our privilege.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm always delighted to see
Great
zoo
job.
and rehabilitator collaboration. It's awesome.
I think so too. There's a lot to learn from both groups.
Absolutely.
And also taking that information and providing it to wildlife agencies so they can better understand physiology, because often they don't. They don't know what these birds require, and so it's helpful data for them as well. Blood values and that kind of stuff.
And even handling, that was something we learned very early on in the California Condor program. There was mistrust between field biologists and zoo biologists. And we learned very quickly that we had to work very closely together and do a lot of cross training. And it's hugely benefited the population and a lot of other species.
Yeah, I agree. That's wonderful. Okay.
Thank you, Susie and Michelle, for sort of filling us in on that. It is 7:02, and I know I'm hungry, and bet you some of the folks here are hungry too. But I really appreciate you showing up, and your questions are great. And we're going to be doing more of these. Next year is the 50th year of bird rescue, and we've got some things planned. So stay tuned, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you guys and hear your voices. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.